Today's sermon is about a Shakespearean tragedy long before Shakespeare was born, and it's related for us in the Bible. A few weeks ago, I spoke about good King Josiah, and to me that was an inspiring, motivating sermon. It was fun to preach, and I learned a lot preparing the information about good King Josiah, who lived many centuries later from the period of time we're going to consider this morning. But the Bible relates for us some events that took place in the lives of other kings and tells us about their character. And there are many important lessons that we can and we must learn from these kings. Some of them, for example, the very first, King Saul, had their really good points. And then they also had some tendencies that were self-destructive. They had their fatal flaws. And that's the reason I described this lesson as a Shakespearean tragedy in the earliest sense of that term. If you look at what dramatists write about a tragedy, there are certain formulaic things that have to go into it to make it a real tragedy. But the basic idea is this. It is a hero. It is a promising figure, a personality, who has so much potential to rise to greatness and who is on the way to greatness, but who has a fatal flaw and who tragically will fall. His heroic life begins with such promise, but it ends in ruin. That's what we have here, as we're going to see in pretty much all of the book of 1 Samuel, particularly beginning in about chapter 8 and going through the rest of the book. So we'll have to pick and choose carefully this morning for the sake of time the highlights of that section of Scripture. But as we do so, we'll learn much about the life of this tragic man. And it is really a classic tragedy in the proper sense of that term. And it's not here for entertainment. I know Shakespeare may have written for that reason. It's here for our edification. Whatsoever things were written aforetime, Paul says in Romans 15 and verse 4, were written for our learning. So we're reading about this so that we can learn. And there's much here to learn. Where do we begin? Well, let's just talk about the beginning of the nation state of Israel to give the right kind of background to understand what's going on here in chapter 8 as we will begin. There was a system of government that we could call a theocracy in the technical sense, the rule of God. Now that word gets bandied about a lot today, and many times in an inaccurate sort of way. There is an objectionable sense to it. The idea that the government would require us to worship according to its dictates. Nobody really in the modern world would want a system like that, we wouldn't think. But there's another sense in which theocracy embraces the idea of a people who recognize God as their sovereign. God is their maximum leader. Now that was the case here. Israel was chosen to be a separate people. It was chosen to be a nation state. Now, there are various ways of defining that, but we see that in principle, God is not opposed to the idea of a language, culture group which has a shared ideology, recognizing certain territorial boundaries, more or less, as they recognized them in Israel's day once they occupied the land, which would define them as a nation state. There's nothing wrong in principle with that idea. God was not against it. But now let's look at what was going on in the beginning after the children of Israel entered into the land of Canaan. When they had conquered their enemies, although not all of them, but a large number of them, and began to occupy the cities and the surrounding environs for them to be able to plant their vineyards and to raise their crops. Israel's supreme leader at this time was God himself. God was their supreme leader. And at the beginning, they so recognized him. He was king, king of kings. He was Lord, Lord of lords. Now, politically speaking, this is a summary of what we learned in the earlier chapters of the books that describe the rise of Israel. This was a loose confederation of 12 tribes. Now, each of the tribes is organized in various ways with leaders, clans, heads of clans, families, and so on. There was organization in each of the tribes. We might think of the tribes somewhat analogous to provinces or states, because the tribes were given various territorial boundaries themselves. And so you had then the nation of a confederation. Then, in times of special needs, in a national crisis, when the enemies of God, for example, would attack his people, then there would arise certain men that would, and sometimes women, but usually men, who would be called judges. And this is where we have the title to the book of Judges. Now let me explain. The word judges is probably not really the best term to have chosen by King James translators and others. It's not wrong, but it's not the best idea, because to us a judge is one in a black robe who's in a formal courtroom setting, who considers the evidence in a case where someone is accused and adjudicates the matter. That's not exactly what these men and sometimes women were. They were rather somewhat like warlords or tribal chieftains who would rise to national prominence over all the Confederation to help in the mutual defense of all the tribes that were involved. And they would exist for a period of time. They would come to power to accomplish the purpose of thwarting the goals of the enemies of God, gaining back territory and so on. And then they would sort of subside, and they would not be of such prominence. But they were not monarchs in the technical sense. They were not kings. In the period of time now before us, that I would say begins roughly in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we're looking at God's rule over his people specifically through a great prophet, the prophet Samuel. Now Samuel, we know his story. We're not going to all of that. He was unique in that, being of the tribe of Levi, he could serve in priestly capacities, but he was also a prophet, which meant he received special revelations from God. God would communicate to him into his mind, and he would be able to reveal to others around him what heaven wished for them on particular occasions for specific matters. Not all had the gift of prophecy, as has always been the case. Only a select few did. And Samuel was one, and thus he was also like one of the last judges, because he too had the capacity of being a warlord at times and helping to fight the Philistines, for example, the enemies of God who continually pestered them on their eastern flank, or western flank, rather. God had earlier warned Israel, as David just read for us a moment ago, that there may be a time in your history when you will desire to set up over yourselves a strong man that you will call a king. He'll be like the strong men of the nations round about you. Now what we have to understand is that the Lord never encouraged that. He did not desire that arrangement for his people. He warned them. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel the prophet again will warn them in particular about the principles that had been uttered many centuries earlier by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, about the king that they would select. And he tells them, you don't want a monarchy. And by having a king, the one centralized figure, a central government, a centralized government, wherein the tribes basically lose all their sovereignty to the one big man at the top of the heap. By doing that, in effect, you are rejecting me, God says. You're rejecting me as your leader. So this was the warning in 1 Samuel chapter 8. The idea was these tribes should have continued to serve under God as their supreme leader. Now, of course, they would do so through representatives, the priests and the prophets and so on, and those who were the head of their tribes. But this was the idea, all under the covenant made in the law of Moses, as it were a constitution. But God knew that they were just a recalcitrant people. They were stubborn, and they wanted their way. They wanted to be like the nations round about them. As an aside, historians say the 19th century was like that in the modern era. There had been early on in the century, all throughout Europe, a number of nation states, city-states, small enclaves of people who had pretty much autonomy and self-rule. And then you had many of the nations, Austria, I think, and also Germany in particular, and Italy, that began to arise and to form a centralized government. Right in the middle of the 19th century, there was such a fervor all over Europe, all over the world, to have centralized governments. Let's do away with the confederations. Well, it infected our own country. We know the great outcome that took place there when the Hamiltonian view of the American system prevailed and the Jeffersonian view was squashed. And thus we to this day are under a strong centralized government, virtually a monarchy with 3 branches. But anyway, that's an aside, and it tells us something about currents of thought, trends in people's thinking. We want to be like the nations round about us. Lincoln and others in our nation also said, let's be like the nations of Europe and form a strong centralized government. Well, God's view is made clear right here. It's made clear. In 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5, basically the message from heaven to the people is this: be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. They did. We did. They did. But now, since God knew of their stubbornness, He was going to let them see. They had to learn for themselves what it would mean to have an earthly monarchy. It's not what you think. It's not the panacea for all your ills. God Himself said, I will select the first king. So God did. Now, He didn't go to the great powerful men in Israel. There were certain wealthy ones who were known all around the nation. Rather, He went to an unassuming farmer from a very small tribe, Benjamin, and a relatively obscure family, the family of Kish. Saul was the son of Kish, and Saul was selected. Now, he seemed to be a very good choice at the beginning. Generally speaking, let's say this about him. He was an humble man at the beginning, a likable kind of guy. You would have liked to have Saul as your neighbor. He was that tall, ruddy, handsome man, known taller than all his peers. Good looking. He was just a nice guy. And he was very unassuming and humble. And he was not very big in his own eyes. In fact, later Samuel will say, you were little in your own sight. 1 Samuel 15, verse 17. He was a considerate person of his family. As we will see in a moment, as he was out looking for some lost donkeys, he worried his father was worrying about him. You know, when you get older, you ask your kids, text me or call me when you go on a long trip, just to let us know you got there safely. Well, this is the idea, and he knew his father was concerned. He was a man who was considerate. 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 5. He was even a little bit timid. He's not like the sort of prideful monsters that you will encounter in his day among all the pagan nations of the world, the despotic civil governments that surrounded them in ancient times. He's not like that, not at the first, not at the beginning. But you could say something else might be the case. He was so humble and even timid, as we will see, that he might have had a fragile ego. I don't know. I'm just wondering. It's hard to psychoanalyze a man after millennia of his being gone. But when you read between the lines, you kind of get that impression, as we will see. But he was a hard-working man, a field hand. He's not afraid of manual labor, 1 Samuel 11 and verse 5. This is not the kind of guy who was born with a royal spoon in his mouth, as many who are born to the dynasties of our world today that we often laugh at because of the way they're pampered from their youth. Not like that at all. The Spirit of God is going to come upon Saul, and he's going to become a prophet. He will literally prophesy. The Holy Spirit will come upon him, as we will see. God, it said, would change his heart. 1 Samuel 10 and verse 9. I don't think that implies a miracle. I believe it's that the responsibility that would be thrust upon him and his gift of prophecy would cause him to see that he has a new life before him. He would change his heart. He would be a victorious warrior in early campaigns. This tall, physical man with great prowess. The very sort of king for which the people were clamoring. This is the guy. That's generally about his life. But deep within this man's psyche, in his soul, there's something simmering we can't see on the surface. There are certain seeds of self-destruction, and they're going to finally be sown. Let's look at some of the high points of his early career. I'm having a hard time choosing them all, but we'll do our best to look at the big important things. You may have heard of the story of three smart-aleck young boys who were walking down the road and they came across an old gentleman, an old gospel preacher, and they decided to make fun of him. "Hello, Father Abraham," one of them said. And the other said, "No, hello, Father Isaac." And the other said, "Hello, Father Jacob." And they thought that was so funny. And he said, "Boys, I'm neither Abraham, Isaac, nor Jacob. I am Saul, the son of Kish. I'm seeking my father's asses, and I have found them." You've heard that, and you wonder, what's the background story to the joke? Well, let's tell it, because it's pertinent to the story of this man. Providence had caused something to happen. Some donkeys got lost. Kish's donkeys wandered away. That's a big deal if you're a farmer. You need the animals for the work they can provide. So Saul and a servant were sent out to find them. In 1 Samuel 9 and verse 3, when they could not be found, then Saul wanted to go back to his father so he wouldn't worry. This is what I was telling you about a while ago. 1 Samuel 9 and verse 5. He was concerned about his father's worry. Now on the way, somebody informed him and his servant that there was a seer in the area around Zuph. Now, a seer, the Bible explains, was the word that was used early to describe what we now call a prophet. And that seer, of course, was the prophet Samuel. Samuel, the day before, had been told by God through special revelation, tomorrow you will meet the man that I have selected to be king over my people. So he knew it was going to happen. Here comes Saul, completely oblivious of all of this that's going on behind the scenes. He didn't know why the donkeys were lost. He's just looking for them. And he thinks that by asking the man of God, who has special insight, he could tell him where the lost donkeys are. So this is just setting it up. And they have a private meeting together. And while they're together, Samuel will anoint Saul to be the new king over Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 1. Then Saul was sent out to a group of prophets who were coming out of Gibeah and was told to join them. And he began to prophesy with them, ecstatic utterances, so that the people asked, is Saul now among the prophets? So he was associated with that religiosity very early on. Now notice this. In this meeting with Samuel, this first meeting, Saul was explicitly told there's going to be a future time that's appointed when you are to go to Gilgal, and you are to wait there 7 days for me to come, when I will offer sacrifice. You wait for me 7 days, and I will give you further instruction then. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 8. That's important. That detail will figure in prominently later. So then, next Samuel will gather together all the tribes of Israel at Mizpah for a formal public inauguration of Saul as king. This was a trial and error process, it seemed. Now, it was the choice already made, but it looks like this must be what happened. That Samuel, as a matter of formality, chose each of the tribes and he eliminated them all till he got down to Benjamin. And then when he got to Benjamin, he looked at all the different clans and he eliminated all except the clan from which Saul came, the tribe, the son of Kish. And he finally said, Saul is the man. So he was reduced out of all the others, funneled down to him. Where is he? Saul can't be found. They started looking for him. 1 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 22. He was hiding. He was found among the stuff, or he was found among the baggage, one of the newer translations says. Here was a man who didn't want the limelight. That's what I said. Self-effacing, humble, sort of timid. He just didn't want to be thrust into the limelight at the first. So he's brought there and made the king before them all. Samuel wrote down instructions for kingship. I wonder if this is not sort of like a constitution for the monarchy. And most of the people accepted Saul as their king at this time. However, 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 27, he had a few enemies. There were some holdouts. They didn't accept him. And of course, many took note of that. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he would reign for 42 years. 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 1. He goes back to his field, even though he's now king, and he starts working again in the field. It so happened that the Ammonites decided to attack Israel, the town of Jabesh Gilead. In chapter 11, verses 1 to 10, we have the narrative. So now the people will see what he can do. And Saul, when he learns of this attack, gathers together an army, and he goes and he successfully wages war against the Ammonites and defeats them. And he rescues the people of Jabesh Gilead. Now, before the people, he's the de facto leader. He's the actual king. They can see that he has the power to do these things. And he's thus confirmed again as the king at Gilgal, chapter 11, verses 12 to 15. Then some of them say, now's your time to get even with those holdouts, the ones at first who didn't accept you when Samuel first announced your kingship. He said, no. Now this shows us something about the early qualities. He was merciful. And he says, I'm not going to get even against my enemies. Let it be. Leave them alone. This good promise here for a man who's going to be a benevolent monarch, it seems. But something else happened. Samuel again scolds the people, and they deserve it. Why? He scolds them for the whole arrangement. You wanted a king, but it was wrong. And he recited how the Lord himself had always been their protectorate, always been fighting for them. Chapter 12, verses 5 to 24. And then Samuel solemnly warned the people, but if you still do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. Chapter 12, verse 25, 1 Samuel. That's a general warning. and it's for all time and for all peoples. So what we have to this point is a hero of great promise. It was not ideal. God didn't want this arrangement. But if the people are going to require it, if they're going to insist on it, all right, you get what you asked for. And they're going to learn their lesson. Here we have a great man of God, right? One who's going to lead them victoriously against all of their enemies. But then we begin to see the beginning of the end of Saul. Something happens to this humble man, this good guy, this nice neighbor you would want to have as your friend. Here he is at the top of his form. Everything is going well. But then, remember how I'd read earlier that Saul was told by Samuel at the very first, there's going to be an appointed time when you will wait for me at Gilgal for 7 days. You go there and wait, and I'll come and offer the sacrifices. Well, he goes there. But while he's there, the Philistines, these uncircumcised heathen. Now, they're strange people. It's hard for us to identify them. They seem to be a mixture. They're considered to be the descendants of Ham. We normally think of the Hamitic peoples as moving into North Africa. But they're also, we know culturally, the descendants of Japheth. They're very Greek-like, or sort of like the Minoan early civilization of the Mediterranean. Their pottery is very Minoan, and their headdress, and we see the reliefs that they left, and we can see what they looked like, how their soldiers were dressed. It's hard to figure out who the Philistines were, but they came in successive waves to Palestine, landed on the shore of the Mediterranean, and began to make inroads into the hill country, and they constantly are pestering the people of God. Uncircumcised heathen who worship false gods. These are the people. They're all gathered together, and Saul is fearful, and the people start to scatter. Well, we can't beat these people. This is not like the Ammonites. These are tough guys. So they started to scatter, and Saul decided, I got to do something. So he went ahead, and even though Samuel was not there, after 7 days, he, the king, now of course he can do this, right? He's king. He offered the sacrifice. Just as soon as this happened, Samuel comes and he asks, what have you done? Well, the people were scattered, he said, so I thought it was necessary. Some people cannot be told anything. Some people don't listen. No matter what the instructions are, how clear they are, you wait for me 7 days. He knew better. He was king now, you see. It's starting to go to his head. He had been given all these accolades as the victorious warrior over the Ammonites. You saved Jabesh Gilead. You're our new leader. And he starts to do something to a man. Some sort of pride begins to enter in. We don't know exactly why this happened, but he did it contrary to the Lord's command. Somebody would say, well, that's a nitpicky thing. I mean, the sacrifice was offered. Did it matter who did it, whether it was Samuel or Saul? Did it matter? Because of this, it was said that his kingdom would not endure. You're not going to have a dynasty or a legacy, Samuel says, because you did not obey the Lord. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart. Chapter 13, 14, a foreshadowing of David who's about to come on the scene. Why did this happen? Well, it may have been pride of power. I know good enough to do this on my own. You don't have anything to tell me. I know it all already. Some have often said, this is an old adage you've heard 1,000 times, if power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Here they are investing in this earthly figure, absolute power, a monarchy. Starts to go to his head. He's sort of taking it for granted now he's the maximum leader. And I would say that now Israel finds itself in the incipient stages of what we can call stateism, the worship of civil power, the worship of the organization of mankind. It is a form of idolatry, and it's seen many times throughout history. Saul seemed to think he was above the law. But lex rex, not rex lex, the Italian would say, or rather the Latin. Lex rex, law is king, according to the biblical teaching. It's right here. Not the king is law, not rex lex. And there is a world of difference between these two concepts. Total civilizations diverge at this point. Under which civilization do we live? Saul and Jonathan, his son, decide to attack the Philistine garrison at Gibeah. They have an outpost there. And when they did so, this infuriated their enemies. Some would say, oh, don't attack your enemies. Don't respond. You'll make them mad, and they'll be galvanized into fighting you and hurting you. This is a constant refrain we hear. That's not the way the Israelites looked at it. But it did happen that way. They attacked the Philistines. So they come out as one whole nation, a mighty nation, to get revenge against Saul and Jonathan. They had occupied these Philistines large swaths of Israelite territory and many of their towns for a long time. They had been practicing gun control, arms control. They didn't have guns. There were no blacksmiths in Israel. The Philistines didn't permit it. All the iron had to come from the Philistines, and they didn't let them have anything but plowshares and farm implements. You couldn't have swords and spears. There were very few. Chairman Mao said cynically once that political power all resides at the muzzle of a gun. Well, that's power politics, and they recognize that. 1 Samuel 13, verses 16 to 22. Now Israel's enemies, the Philistines, come out in full force to seek their revenge. While the Philistines were at Michmash, Jonathan, the son of Saul, went out with a small garrison and attacked some of them, saying, "For the Lord is not restrained to save by many or few." Chapter 14 and verse 6. And he put the Philistines on the run at this time. Something he didn't know had happened. This tells us more about the man Saul, his father. The king had made all of his soldiers to be bound by a foolish oath. He said, you're not to eat anything. You are to fast until the battle is over. You have to win it before you can get a chance to eat again. Jonathan wasn't there and didn't know about the foolish oath. Did it come out of the law of Moses? No, it came out of the mind of Saul. I want to prove your loyalty to me. Me, the maximum leader. They were famished. They weren't very successful because they hadn't eaten enough and the troops were falling by the wayside. On the way, Jonathan, who didn't know about it, chapter 14 and verse 24, found some honey, some wild honey, and he ate of it. Later, Saul finds out somebody disobeyed his order in his army. They ate food before the battle was over. Who was it? He's going to be executed. It's your son, Jonathan. Well, all right, Jonathan, you're going to be executed. So he's going to kill his own son. In the name of my absolute might and control, it will prevail. This shows us something about his absolutist, his extremist tendencies as they begin to come out little by little. Only the fellow soldiers saved Jonathan. No, you're not going to kill yours. No, he didn't know. You're not going to get away with this. And they made him back down. But this shows tyrants throughout history, the Stalins of the world, the Neros, the Herods of the world, who kill even their closest friends and their own loved ones in the name of power. Well, let's look at a few further high points that are found in the continued reign of Saul that lead to his eventual downfall. In 1 Samuel 15, verses 1 to 34, we have another very familiar account of a foolish thing that Saul will do. Samuel and God, through Samuel, had told the Israelites to destroy the Amalekites, every one of them. Don't spare anything. They're under the corporate ban of God. They are devoted to God. Everything. All the spoils of war. The king, they're all to be killed. Old and the young, everybody's destroyed. 1 Samuel 15, 1 to 34. And Saul partially obeyed. Most were killed, but he saved the best of the flock and the herds. He spared the life of his rival king Agag and brought him back as sport, as it were. Samuel confronted him about this. Oh, I obeyed the voice of the Lord. And Samuel said, no, why do I hear the bleating of the sheep? This indicates you did not do what was said. And then, as many do, this man with a fragile ego, as it were, but who wanted all power and who was all-knowing, he said, but I didn't do it. The people did it. The people did it. They wanted to spare some of the flock to sacrifice unto the Lord. They wanted to bend the rules for a good cause, as it were. And so, because of this, it was said, you will lose your kingdom. Not just your dynasty. You're going to be taken out as king. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Chapter 15 and verse 22. And to hearken than the fat of rams. So in chapter 16, David, the son of Jesse, is anointed in secret by Samuel to be the new king. But this happens behind the scenes, and it's going to take some time for this actually to develop. When this happens, something really drastic occurs in the thinking of Saul. In chapter 16 and verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. Remember, he had been among the prophets and literally had the prophetic gift. Now God's Spirit leaves the man. And in its place, his place, comes an evil spirit. An evil spirit came upon him. What is this exactly? Depression? Yes. Anxiety, yes. Paranoia, certainly, as we will see. Was more involved? We don't know. Something from the demonic realm? We don't know. But they were related somehow, whether it was miraculously or just through these emotional maladies. As therapy for his deep, dark depression, somebody said, you need music. And they knew of a great musician, the young man, David, the shepherd boy. So he's brought in, and when the king is going through one of these horrible periods of darkness, David plays the harp, and it helps. It soothes a little bit. Then David, has this episode with Goliath. Now, I'm not telling the story about David. It only helps us to understand Saul today. And he beats the giant, and then he's suddenly acclaimed as a great warrior in all of Israel. Saul has David brought into his army. And then he begins to send him out on other missions, and David is always successful. David will become very close friends to Jonathan, Saul's son. David was given a high rank because of his success. This pleased the people that he got that rank. It also pleased the officers in the army. You see trouble brewing now? The women started singing. Much trouble is about to happen. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. 1 Samuel 18 and verse 7. He heard it and he was galled by it. He was angered by it. And he began to view David as a rival. He began to view him with suspicion. And yet David is still in his court. And he's still there playing the harp for him. Sometimes the evil spirit comes upon Saul and he takes his spear and he throws it across the room at David and he ducks and it jams into the wall. It's trying to tack his hide to the wall, trying to kill him. David will flee, but for a while he seems to come back. He hadn't gotten the message. Hey, he's really trying to kill you. He's really after you. Like all tyrants who fear possible usurpers, Saul eyed David with great suspicion. This evil spirit came so strong upon Saul that he began to pursue David. He wanted to kill him. From that time forward, Saul vacillated between admiration for the young man David and jealousy. Admiration, it's a hard thing to understand. In his psyche, he did like him. He loved him in a way. But in another way, you see the tragedy as it unfolds. Oh, Shakespeare couldn't have invented this. It really happened. And then also the horrible angst that he feels when he realizes he's losing his kingdom. So David has to flee. He has to run from the court. He's out in the wilderness with a small cadre of men running from Saul. Saul is pursuing him. He's got to get rid of this threat to his power. David goes to the priests of Nob, and they help him by giving him some bread and sustaining his men. When Saul learns about it, he comes and he assassinates all the priests. 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22. Now, more than once, while David is being pursued in the wilderness by Saul, David has chance by night to come in and to kill Saul. He comes up to him, he'll do things like cut part of his garment off. The next day, stand up on a cliff and say, Saul, I could have killed you, but I didn't. You're God's anointed. Leave me alone. Quit following me. On one occasion, Saul was so moved by that, as it were, he wept and he was penitent and he said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, son. I shouldn't be going after you. 1 Samuel 24 and verse 16. But this penitence didn't last very long. And again, he tries to take his life. And again, David spares Saul's life, chapter 26. But now we see the Lord had departed from Saul. He's no longer with him. Samuel has died in the meantime. There's no prophet to guide him. This was Saul's mentor. The only one he could trust. The only one he really loved and he knew would not hurt him. And yet Samuel is gone. Saul has nowhere to turn and no one to turn to. So the Philistines are again threatening. They're gathering against all of Israel. And Saul is fearful, chapter 28, verses 4 and following. There's no prophet to consult. What do I do? What do I do? Heaven was silent. Lord, help me. But heaven didn't answer. How terrible, brothers and sisters, for people to get in such a state where they can cry unto God and he no longer hears them. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he will not hear. Isaiah 59 and verse 2. He didn't know what to do. You know, God had told Saul and others, they had enforced this rule for a while, to get rid of all the mediums in Israel. Now, I didn't say media, but mediums, that is, witches, sorcerers, people that tried to speak to the dead, necromancers. Get rid of them all. Most of them had been wiped out, but there were a few holdouts who hid their wares from the public. Well, it so happened Saul knew about the witch of Endor, And he disguised himself so she wouldn't know he was the king. And he went to her and said, I need your help. You've got to conjure up somebody. Who do I conjure up? I need to speak to Samuel. He wants to bring up the ghost of Samuel. Well, it's a surprising story. And I think she was as surprised as he. But she called up Samuel's ghost. And guess what? He came forth from Sheol and scared the life out of both of them. And then Samuel asked, or Saul rather, Samuel, what do I do? He's speaking to this ghost to ask what to do. And Samuel reprimanded him for disturbing him. Now, he'd been at rest, at peace. Why did you bring me back? And he said, the Lord is going to become your enemy, Saul. The Lord is now your enemy. And Samuel said, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. 1 Samuel 29 and verse 19. In other words, you're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. The next day, Saul was wounded in battle by a rogue Philistine arrow. He asked his armor bearer to kill him so he would not have to go through the indignity of being taken. But the armor bearer was fearful and didn't, so Saul committed suicide, and so did the armor bearer. The Philistines did find his body. They cut off his head, took his body back to their hideous temple at Beth Shan, and they hung it up on the wall as a trophy, his body, there to the Ashtaroth, or the false gods they worship. Some Israelites learned about it, and a group of Israelite guerrilla fighters later came in and retrieved the body and gave it proper burial. Israel lost the war. There's a lot to be learned. I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Much of it we've seen. First of all, we noticed the lost donkey episode. Something about providence in very little things. Why did the donkeys get lost? So there would be this meeting of Saul and Samuel, and that happened. Maybe little things like that happen in your life, and you don't know why they happen now. Though very controversial, I'm going to ask us all, I'm going to ask the world, from this narrative, how can we not infer that a strong centralized government based on powerful physical force like monarchy is evil, according to God? It bears evil consequences and it robs us of our freedom. How can we not see that here? How can you see otherwise? Samuel had warned the people that a king would rule over them in such a way that they couldn't bear it. It would be oppressive. He will tax you, he said. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 11 down to 18. He will tax you. By the way, he did. Wow, 10%. Now that's in addition to the 10% they had to give for religious causes, the tithe. 10% of your income. And that's a tyrant back in biblical times. And then he said he will conscript your sons into the army. He will force them to fight. He will force your daughters into being cooks and to help them. So he will make the people live in virtual servitude. What? A strong, all-powerful, central earthly government that does not recognize God as supreme. That's what he warned about. Good government is always government under the law of God. Romans 13. We have a problem in our country. Tensions we have to try to work out. We have misinterpreted, evidently, our framers' intent. We think this country was supposed to be a neutral, secular nation. Neutrality, in terms of divine law versus earthly law, is impossible. It will either be the law of God over a nation or the will of man, relativistic ethics. For many generations, the law of God reigned supreme in this country. Not perfectly, but it did, and now we're living in another country, one in which the will of man is supreme. So we learn good government is based upon the principles of God. Somebody says, but a theocracy is a bad thing. We don't want to be like Israel, where Washington tells us we all should be members of this or that church. No, our forefathers were wise in avoiding that. I'm here to say, and I know this sounds radical to many, there are limitations on all freedoms. Some freedoms, when gone to the max, can eat up itself, can destroy themselves. For example, absolute freedom of religion is not freedom. Why? Absolute freedom of religion allows certain religions that hate all other religions to have free reign to destroy all religions. So you ironically allow certain religions to thrive in your midst, and their own intent is to destroy every other religion and to become the supreme religion and abolish all religions. Some things don't work. How do I say this in a way that's acceptable and right? All good governments have to be based upon theism, belief in God. But more than that, there are all kinds of theisms, belief in the God of the Bible. But more than that, the complete Bible, the Old and New Testaments. Good governments have to be based on Christian principles, at least Christian morality. That has to be the case. I don't want the government to tell me how to worship. But when laws are enacted, any kind of law has to have a basis underneath it that's morality. And the only real morality comes from God. And the only way that we can know that real morality is through a study of the will of God, and it's basically found in the Bible. Some things can be known outside the Bible, but basically the Bible. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. A people who rebel against the principles of good government that comes from the morality of God deserve a tyrannical government, and they'll get it. And that government will punish them. Even humble, good people can be corrupted if lifted up and exalted with pride. It's sort of like the statement about the novice in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 6. A young new convert should not be made an elder or a leader in the church, because being lifted up with pride, he will fall into the condemnation of the devil. Envy and jealousy lead to suspicion and murder. Jesus warned about murders being just hatred of your brother, Matthew 5:21 and 22. Envy and jealousy will lead to delusion, will lead to paranoia. An evil spirit is a good description of this hatred and murder that comes upon many. When we feel threatened, our welfare or our status by somebody else, we may hate them and want to destroy them. The devil often tries to gain a foothold in our lives through our relationships with other people, as in the case of Saul and David. Obedience to God consists even in the little things. This has to be an obvious lesson. What was the beginning of the end? Remember we noticed a while ago, Samuel had told Saul to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days, and I will come. Samuel said, I will offer the sacrifice. What's the big deal? Somebody wonders today, that's a little thing. Why would he lose his dynasty? Because he himself offered the sacrifice. The same sacrifice. It's just he did it instead of Samuel. But he did it in the same way. Why the big deal? Well, we Bible readers see the big deal. It's because God had said to do it in the way Samuel instructed. God had said it. And no man, not even a great supreme king of a powerful people, no man has the right to change the will of God, even in the little things. Saul had spared some of the booty that had come from the Amalekites, and he spared the life of King Agag. And then he tried to deflect the blame on the other people. Many sinners were like that. It's not my fault. I didn't do it. I'm the victim. We conclude with the words of Samuel to Saul, the warning about what he had done in the case of the Amalekites. 1 Samuel 15:22. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken is better than the fat of rams. Have you obeyed this morning? Are you a child of God? Are you ready to meet Him? Are you a good person who will remain humble and always in the service of God? If you get successful, will it go to your head and cause you to lose your good standing? These are the lessons we learn. If you need to, in some way, let it be known what your desire is this morning, either to be baptized or to confess wrong as an erring child of God. Either one, let us know about it right now while together we stand and sing.